Hey everyone. Today's guest is Dr. Peter Joshi, whose group published a biological age clock known as the Bortz clock that may be better than PhenoAge, which I recently show on the channel, at least for its association for risk of death for all causes. Today, Dr. Joshi will present those data, and afterwards, I'll challenge him with some potential biomarker weak spots in the Bortz clock, including cholesterol, SHBG, and MCH. So with that, welcome, Peter, and let's get into the presentation.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks for inviting me to talk to you today. Thanks for the opportunity to present this work, which we did a few years ago in communications biology. Needless to say, in modern science, it wasn't all my work. You can see the co-authors on the paper here, and I need to particularly acknowledge the contribution of Jordan Bortz, who really did a fantastic job and a lot of work, vast majority of the work that we're going to look at today. So just to give you a flavor of what that paper concluded before we get into how we did it and the details of the findings. The Bortz clock shows 2.5 times the predictive value of PhenoAge acceleration. So Bortz biological age acceleration is 2.5 times as predictive as Michael suggested of all-cause mortality. And I'll explain exactly where that 2.5 times figure comes from as we go through. The spread in biological ages accelerations that we measured in the cohort under study were plus or minus 20 years. Most people were not scoring plus or minus 20 years. Most people were in the plus or minus 3, plus or minus 4 category, but we do see a real spread of that biological age acceleration within the cohort. And the cohort, the research is built on a cohort I think a lot of people will be familiar with, that if they're not UK Biobank, that it was a cohort set up by the UK government in the early 2000s with actually 500,000 participants, which is a huge number, and just makes life so much easier when we're looking for associations and analyses of these form, because you're not doubting your statistics. Or your statistical significance. It's either clearly significant or it's not interesting typically. Only 300,000, I say only 300,000 is a huge number, obviously. He had the actual blood biomarkers measured. I had a blood draw and had those blood biomarkers then measured and assayed. And importantly, they measured about 50 blood biomarkers. So we were able to study many, many biomarkers in this very large cohort and really understand which one of those were useful in developing a biological age model. And then the one thing beyond those 3 headlines that I'd like to emphasize is that we had the idea as we went through this paper, or we're drawing up this paper, that not simply producing another biological age clock, but producing an ability where you didn't have all of the biomarkers measured in, say, PhenoAge or in, say, our 25 biomarker clock, but had a subset of them measured, or a different set, indeed, of them measured. Wouldn't it be really useful to get an estimate of your Bortz bioage? And so we looked into that and found that that worked really quite nicely, and that we got really quite reasonable predictive value considering the situation that the model is being presented with. So the model does not require all 25 biomarkers to be measured for us to estimate your biological age. I think a lot of people watching will be familiar with biological age, but if you can just indulge me for a moment and I'll talk a little bit about my perspective on biological age. Everybody's obviously familiar with chronological age, the age you are on your birthday. But I think everybody, particularly those of you who've been to a high school reunion, will also be familiar with the fact that people age at different age rates, particularly those who've been to, say, a 25-year high school reunion. Be a very different sense of people that you knew at the age of 18, who are all now 23 in our example, or 43, sorry, in our example, certainly appear physically different. And it's not just about their skin tone or their hair color. Their whole stature often looks very different, and you get a strong sense of, who looks like they're healthy and have a good health outlook and who doesn't. A biological ages in the field is a bit more scientific than turning up and forming impressions over a social reunion. Um, and there's many ways of measuring biological age. I think the archetypal biological clock for a lot of people is DNA methylation. Is Hahnemann and Horvath developed DNA methylation clocks and showed how they could actually track chronological age very, very well by measuring DNA methylation. And that gave a lot of impetus to the idea that aging and biological aging is happening at a cellular level. There's lots of other things. Telomere length is often cited. Um, but we've done work with proteomics in a different paper. But today we're going to talk about blood-based biomarkers. The sort of blood tests that you get in a routine clinical blood testing, your cell blood counts, your cell hematology, and things like liver function tests, cholesterol tests. UK Biobank surveyed all of that blood biomarker information, and we used that to develop our biological age. So why am I such an advocate for biological age? I think it really comes down to that it connects with people. I think a lot of us have had blood tests, and if you get a particularly poor cholesterol test, you might hear your doctor saying, "Oh, your mortality is 1.4 times population average." Yes, as epidemiologists, biological scientists, that means something to us. You're still actually left with this statement: well, what's my absolute risk? Do I need to be worried about 1.4 times or not? But for the vast majority of the population, I think that makes very limited connection with them. It sounds bad, but how bad? On the other hand, if we tell somebody who is 50 that your biological age is 54, that means something to them, and something they can relate to directly, and I think importantly relate to directly with exactly the right proportion of concern. It sounds concerning, but it's not terrible. They presumably know a few 54-year-olds, and they're not desperately worried about their outlook for chronic disease or their excuse me, but at the same time, or their mortality. But at the same time, for a 50-year-old, it's somewhat concerning. And wouldn't it be much nicer if we were getting a reading of 46, not 54? And that brings us to the third point. Biological age acceleration, admittedly risk number 2, but biological age acceleration responds to behavior change. And that's really our mission at Humanity. It is to make available biological age en masse to a very, very large segment of the population, to measure its trend, and to talk to people about how they can manage their biological age and then see their biological age being managed and improving and provide a virtuous circle of reinforcing feedback that keeps them going. As my friends in accountancy often say, if you can measure it, you can manage it. And that's why and you need a relatable measure, I guess, in that context. And that's why we're such advocates of biological age and the sort of biological age we're going to talk about here today, which can be made available at relatively low cost to lots and lots of people.
Peter, just to interject real quick.
Sure.
And for those who are saying, why are you interrupting his presentation? Peter said that it's okay, that we can have a more collaborative discussion rather than wait to the end. So just for the people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So a big bonus too of biological age tracking is when most people get their blood test results, and I say for most people, I say this humbly, I'm in a different boat because I've been studying biomarkers and quote unquote, what's optimal based on how they look in youth, how they change during aging and their associations with all-cause mortality risk. So rather than the reference range, I'm pretty well familiar with quote unquote what's optimal for youth and potentially longevity. So, but for most people that will get their blood test report, they're only looking at within ranges, and even most MDs will say, "Ah, you're within range, you're fine." Even though things like maybe very low. I mean, if you've got red blood cells that are say 4, and I mean this is close to aged relative to youth. So it'll still be within range, but it will be missed. So the point I'm trying to make is
Yes.
the beauty of biological age clocks, including the Bortz clock, is you get a basically composite measure of all of your data, rather than you could look at all of your data on the lab sheet and it's all within range. But if you've got that plugged into a biological age clock that's been essentially clinically validated, when I say that, I mean, how does it associate with risk of death for all causes? Now, that doesn't prove that it's going to lower your risk. I mean, it's just an association. We'd have to have randomized controlled trials, which who knows when that will happen, right? We can wait years for that. But for the people who may have a tough time in knowing what's truly optimal relative to the reference range, biological age clocks like yours and PhenoAge, can give a composite measure of where their data is. And then by tracking that over time, they can see, all right, look, the composite of these 20 or so biomarkers or 25 biomarkers, my data is getting worse. Even though I'm within range, maybe for all these biomarkers, it's moving in the wrong direction. And that would be associated with a higher mortality risk. In contrast, people who may be doing given interventions and seeing a reduction in their Bortz age or PhenoAge, that would suggest that they're on the right track for improving that systemic milieu of the stuff circulating in blood. So I think another bonus of these biological age clocks, especially the blood-based established biomarkers that have been studied for up to 100 years relative to the epigenetics, is that you can track it over time and then see how well your overall approach, not just looking at markers of metabolic health or lipoproteins, but the full spectrum, liver, kidney, inflammation, the full spectrum. So I think that's another bonus of clocks like yours and PhenoAge.
I couldn't agree more, Michael. As you say, you get a blood testing report, and if you're in a relatively good position, everything's within the normal range. If you know a little bit, then seeing your LDL at the bottom of that normal range, you feel a bit positive about, or vice versa. Maybe I don't know if you tend to look at HbA1c or glucose itself, but your diabetic status, again, you've got some sort of idea. But as I was saying, how good is good, and so on and so on. And as you were saying, it's it's really hard to really form a conclusion. And it's one of the things that, when we talk to clinical testing labs today, and I'll talk a little bit more about our API towards the end of this talk, but we're able to say, well, a lot of people are getting these reports and going, right, okay, my doctor's saying I'm not suffering from any acute disease phase. That's fine, but is there more to this, or what does it mean? And the supplement that we can provide to that report saying this is your biological age, and now we're working on decomposing that biological age in a way that I think you alluded to almost. Is it liver function? Is it glycemic response? Is it metabolic? Which dimension is most benefiting or harming your biological age? And it gives a much more engaging report, which I think makes people engage with their health, makes people engage with their clinical lab reports more as well, and much more likely to have a follow-up. So couldn't agree more.
Definitely.
So I'll talk a little bit about what we did. I'll try not to get into too much detail. Already mentioned, UK Biobank, this very large scale a study, which I feel does enable me confidently to identify associations within that cohort. To be fair, you can't say anything necessarily. Sorry, I believe a lot of the work is very generalizable, but scientifically, the analysis within the cohort, but we're able to precisely identify associations within the cohort. We did one of the classic things. We split it into training and testing, and so we showed that BioAge clock trained in England and Wales generalized to Scotland. So it wasn't just an attribute of the specific populations. And then, as some of you may know, the features of the Scottish population on average are somewhat different from the English population. So that was a nice thing to see. Sadly, clearly for the participants, 18,000 of those participants have died. And that's really where our statistical power comes from. It's not simply that we've got a large number of participants, but those participants have been followed up for a long time. And we managed to see which ones have survived to the end of the period and who hasn't. And then the mathematical method that was being applied was called a elastic net Cox regression with stability selection. And essentially, there's two properties that I'd like to highlight for this method. The first is that rather than with conventional COPS modeling or random effects modeling, where you might see small effects being identified for all of the 50 biomarkers under consideration. We're essentially asking ourselves, let's just focus on biomarkers that really do have a material effect. That makes the model simpler. It makes it more interpretable as a result. The stability selection is saying, well, actually, let's kind of create these models many, many times and see which features are being selected most often. And in this particular approach, we said that a feature had to be adopted by this elastic net regression more than 80% of the times that the model was built. And you can see here, it's roughly half, slightly less than half of the biomarkers that we considered were taken forward. And then for those of you who are into the mathematics, rather than using the penalized regression, we said, now that we've got those markers, let's fit those markers in an unpenalized model so that we get a sort of unbiased estimate of their effects. And then finally, these models produce the thing that I was saying people struggle to understand, which is hazard ratios. We showed a very nice old actuarial empirical rule of thumb where we showed how we could convert mortality risk into biological age. And it's actually incredibly simple. A 10% increase in hazard ratio corresponds to a 1-year increase in biological age. So, having done all that, what did we find? Well, I'm going to talk about concordance indices. Concordance index is basically saying how good are you at predicting whether or not someone is going to die. And the way that's done is that we take the whole cohort and we say, right, let's look at every pair where one person is alive and one person has died. If our model said the person who's died has more risk than the person who didn't die, then that's a thumbs up for the model. That's a success. Conversely, if the person who died seemed to have less risk according to the model, that's a failure. In many cases, 2 people will have survived and we can't do the comparison, or in some cases, 2 people will have died and we can't do the comparison. But where we can do the comparison, we see whether or not the risk model is correct in predicting who would die and who wouldn't. That's called the Harrelson's Concordance Index. I'll not dwell on this, but those of you who want to press pause or have a little think about it, if you score a concordance index of a half, that's essentially, your predictor's as good as tossing a coin. So a half is your absolute baseline. If you can't beat a half, you might as well give up and go home. If you're scoring much less than a half, you could actually use the opposite of your predictor. You could get better predictions than tossing a coin. That obviously shouldn't be happening. So that's our baseline. And then there's actuaries, sorry, I had a previous, or still an actuary, I worked as an active actuary in a previous career. Actuaries who tell you age and sex are good predictors of mortality. That's why life insurance companies ask you about age and sex. Now, if we're going to get into sophisticated biology, we're going to have to do better than that. And, it's very cheap to find out somebody's age and sex. Just ask for the birth certificate if you're an insurance company, for example. Um, so we're going to have to beat age and sex. So with all of that background, and it's hopefully not been too confusing, but hopefully giving you people a grounding as to what we're really, talking about here. Age and sex has a concordance index in our test set of 0.7128. Better than a half. That's good news. Significantly better than. But if we fit PhenoAge or the Bortz clock, we get better still, which is why people have been, used PhenoAge, and we've developed the Bortz clock. And what we showed was the numbers you can see on the slide here. But in essence, the way we measure predictive value is the excess of your predictive power in concordance index terms over age and sex alone. And we're getting about 2.5 times the predictive power using our 25 marker biological age. To be fair, PhenoAge, remember, I think it's 9 biomarkers. It's close to 9 biomarkers anyway. So they're using fewer biomarkers. They developed in a smaller study population. So, it was very solid work. But with UK Biobank and the techniques we used, we were able to get a much bigger predictive power in UK Bio. Relative to age and sex, which is what we think is the benchmark. Michael.
Quick question, Peter. So obviously, the C index, right? So age and sex. So the C index being 0.7648 for Bortz, that's 25 biomarkers after adjusting for age and sex. Is that right?
So in both of these predictive models, what we're actually fitting is age, sex, and biological age acceleration. So, well, obviously for the null model, we're just fitting age and sex. And then we're saying, let's fit age, sex, and the biological age acceleration. And this is the overall concordance index we get in that context. And that's how the C index has been measured.
So what are your thoughts about adding in comorbidities to see if the C index would further improve for Bortz?
So yes, in a way, so you're talking about a pre-existing condition, and I tend to be more excited about actually predicting future health conditions in this context. But absolutely, if we add in a comorbidity, we will see some improvement. We haven't really done that work. I'm going to show something that kind of alludes to something there, but it's undoubtedly the case that the more seemingly relevant information that we bring to the party, often we see an improvement in prediction. To some extent, I think it would still be true. But for example, I think if you brought a comorbidity of diabetes, you might not see a huge improvement because we're measuring HbA1c directly. And so we're getting a sort of continuous measure of your diabetic status as opposed to the binary yes, no. So I think we're incorporating a good deal of that. If it's another kind of comorbidity, I think most obviously cancer in this context, I think we would see some age acceleration, in your inflammation and the immune system that's being captured by the Bortz clock, but I'm pretty sure we're not capturing everything that a cancer diagnosis would tell us.
Cancer would be great to add. I hear you on the diabetes status, but the one that comes to my mind is liver disease, which could include liver cancer. And the reason why that could be potentially important, because I know that urea is a part of the Bortz model. And I didn't have this as one of my 3 biomarkers as a potential weak spot, but urea increases during aging, in part because kidney function declines during aging. And in the UK Biobank, urea's association with all-cause mortality risk is U-shaped. So it makes sense that when considering urea increases during aging, that higher levels, the highest levels, should be associated with an older Bortz age. But that's actually the opposite of what we see. Higher urea in the Bortz clock is associated with a younger biological age, which suggests to me that when considering the other half of that U-shaped curve for urea with all-cause mortality risk, and the only way that can happen, well, first of all, people would have to be on a very low protein diet, which could be some of the, anhedonia of cancer, where people just don't want to eat. So they have low protein intake, low urea. But then the other side of that is urea is made in the liver. So if you have liver disease, it's possible and or probable where blood urea levels would be lower relative to people who are quote unquote healthier, who don't have liver disease. And then that would show up in the clock as if you have really low urea, well, now you're older, when the fact is it's liver disease. The other argument in support of that too could be, and I already mentioned, this is coming, but the cholesterol data where total cholesterol, I mean, as values as high as 400 are associated with a younger Bortz age, which suggests that the people in the UK Biobank that had very low levels were older, right? So one way that could happen too is liver disease, because if the liver isn't putting out cholesterol, then and that's a comorbid condition, right? They've got some liver disease, fatty liver, liver cancer, whatever it may be. The people who have higher cholesterol are going to look healthy relative to the people who have liver disease. And additionally, um, for the cholesterol story, where else was I going with the cholesterol story there? So cancer too, as you mentioned, cancer. So cancer cachexia, LDL is lower. So if there was a way, I mean, what's interesting is I wonder if we can make the Bortz clock even better by adjusting for some of these comorbidities, whether it's cancer or liver disease, um, or taking out some of the biomarkers, just a few that have inverse U shapes during aging, because that's not a linear. This is a linear model. But I just wanted to raise those points. How
No,
can
no,
we?
I think
Yep.
absolutely. I think two very nice points. I think the taking one at a time. I think it is certainly a weakness that you have in some cases sort of U-shaped relationships, and you also find that people who are very ill are not synthesizing certain of the biomarkers, and so you've got a sort of dimension where you get this strange association within a subpopulation that sort of drives a linear model. Um, a I'm maybe covering both points at once here, but anyway, so I think an an interaction term between age and the biomarker thing would be quite a nice thing to bring into this model, firstly. And that would cope with the fact that as people get very old, the signal is different for a given marker, say cholesterol, than it is in the young. Um, a and I think maybe it's effectively this, or my go-to solution without having thought through it too deeply would be the same for comorbidities. That if we have an interaction term with comorbidity status, that we would see a an improvement in the functional prediction over and above merely the fact that we've now told about the comorbidity, that we would actually recognize the sort of biological consequences and sort of adjust appropriately for the particular context in a way that we're not doing at the moment. We're looking at the whole population. So maybe one thing I should say that I hadn't prepared to say is that, these clocks are really focused on people in relatively normal health. I'll show something that shows that they are kind of, our clock at least, it does operate beyond that boundary. But, if somebody knows they're ill and their biological age is coming back, you know, plausibly, decent, that we're not in any way trying to negate the clinical finding um, that underpinned that diagnosis. And it may in fact be that for their particular illness, their diagnosis may be driving a particular biomarker, and that may be resulting in seemingly good biological age, but for them, it's not good news, even though for someone in normal health, it might be.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, are there plans? I know this is a 3-year-old paper, but maybe new for most people. Are there plans to have you moved on from the Bortz clock, or are these analyses that
We
you
have.
look at? It would
I'll come to a couple of those things, and then you can get a little bit more color behind that as we do so, Michael.
cool.
Simplest way forward. So talked about the stability selection, listed all these biomarkers. What is it that we actually thought was useful for predicting biological age? And maybe before we get into all of this, it's worth excuse me, explaining that for example, that what we're saying, the fact that, sorry, what I'm trying to say, the fact that something's not included here doesn't mean it's not important. So LDL does not appear on this page. That doesn't mean we don't think it's important. What we're saying is that if we know all of these markers, the additional mortality contribution of LDL isn't that strong. So effectively, the LDL signal can be subsumed in all of these measures. So in one sense, I'm saying it's not that important. If we know all this, for purposes of biological age and mortality prediction, LDL doesn't tell us that much more. But if you look at your LDL in isolation, yes, of course it's important. So I think that, and that generalizes a little bit more. You'll see we've both got HbA1c and glucose in this slide. But a lot of the glucose signal is captured by HbA1c, as we know, and I would argue perhaps the more important parts of the glucose signal are captured by that. So each one of these markers in conjunction are all talking to each other when we make these estimates. So don't say, oh, that number looks lower than that number, that's more important than that number. That's not the way you can interpret these multivariate models. It needs to be looked at holistically. So with that important caveat, these are the markers that we selected, and you can see cystatin C was the one that we sort of pulled out, firstly as having the biggest effect, albeit with the caveats that I've just gone through about effect sizes in a multivariate model, and being relatively rarely considered in the field, I guess is probably the way to put it. So we thought this is a bit of a novel finding. ERP is another one, obviously, that stands out. That's an indication of inflammation, and particularly acute infection. And then we can see liver and metabolic function here, and we can see red cell distribution width. If your red cells are, in good shape and uniform, that's a sign of good health. So that's the broad domains that were coming out and a sense of what mattered. We alluded to the beginnings of this slide already. We also asked ourselves, does this clock only work in the healthy? And interestingly enough, it works better in the chronic sick than it does in the healthy, albeit relative to other chronically sick people. When we considered a population of the chronically sick alone, we found the predictive power of age and sex alone were much reduced. But when we used our full model, we were getting the same predictive power as we were in the healthy population, and a big improvement on age and sex. So it does work in subsets of the population like that, although it wasn't designed to, and it would be really interesting to put in specific comorbidities and sort of design clocks that were specific to the chronic sick, or the chronic sick with a particular morbidity in particular. And again, we were interested, TDI, sorry to have used, well, I've explained the acronym on this slide, but still it won't be familiar to most people. There's an index of socioeconomic status of deprivation. It's called the Townsend Index, Deprivation Index, that we use in England and Wales, that basically looks at where you live and the sort of social support and all the other things in that area, and gives us a sense of socioeconomic status. And so what we were seeing here was that it was less helpful in the less deprived than the more deprived. So again, in the people who, I guess, chronic sick and the hardy TDI people, they might have things like metabolic syndrome and so on and so on. And what we were seeing was within that population that the biological age was really, significantly more predictive than in the healthier populations. And then I think I alluded to this just at the very beginning. The thing that I think, and you maybe correct me on this, Michael, because you may be familiar with more that's going on at a clinic level, particularly in the States, than I am. But the thing that I felt differentiated our work from a lot of the other work we've seen is we said, okay, we've built this 25 marker model, but most people don't have the 25 markers. Most people have this blood report and they, in the way that we just discussed, I won't go into much more detail, don't know what to do with it. Wouldn't be good if they could do something with that. And the first thing that somebody with PhenoAge, albeit with just 9 markers or some other marker model, particularly ours, would say, well, you need to go and get these other 13 markers measured. Well, I'm not doing that. It's inconvenient. It's expensive. We said to ourselves, well, what if we just take those 9, 12, whatever markers that you have of our 25 and see what we can do with them. And we used a process called 5 nearest neighbors. I suggest your audience look up 5 nearest neighbors imputation on Google or wherever, rather than I go into the details of it. But it's basically a way of estimating the 25 markers from the ones that we know. We said, we now estimate the 25 markers. What can we do with that? And we looked at various different panels. And we've got our null floor, as we've been discussing, of age and sex. And depending on the markers concerned, could we impute quite well? And the short answer was, if we got a full cardiac panel and blood counts, yes. If we got 5 liver function tests, we could do something. It's not bad. It's halfway there. When we think about where PhenoAge sat on this graph, it's not bad. So yeah, we can do something meaningful for someone with a standard blood report. For those of you that mathematically minded, you might think, well, okay, but if you're going to give me those 5 liver tests, would it not be better to build a model for those 5 liver tests directly rather than have this stepping stone in the middle of your 25 marker model? And the short answer is yes, but not by that much. And in some cases, no. As we got more markers in these tests, we are actually seeing what I've called the bespoke model. So, just working directly, going to UK Biobank and saying, right, if I've got these 9 markers, what should my model be? It wasn't making that much difference. Now, those of you who are particularly interested, there are fairly wide statistical confidence intervals around these estimates. But I think what we did feel from the balance of the evidence around this was that actually using imputation was not losing a lot. And the issue is, if somebody comes along with the 9 markers, well, you've got to go to UK Biobank and rebuild that model from scratch. Whereas our approach, we can give you, straight out of the box, the answer. And this is slightly absurd, but strictly speaking, with 25 markers, there's 33 million possible subsets that people could come along with. So we can't pre-populate a lot of them. That's a little bit of a cheat. There are common panels, and we could build those common panels. But different labs do slightly different common panels. What we're saying is that using imputation works. We've talked about this effectively already, but just a little summary. Age, cystatin C, red cell distribution width. You can see the other things on the slide here. As they increase, biological age increases, and conversely, albumin, IGF-1, as they decrease, biological age decreases. And I've done this on what we call a standard deviation scale, which is to say that this is kind of it's like for like. If you're unusually low as the population goes for cystatin C, compared with your unusually high for red cell distribution width, that unusually is being coped with, and so you don't need to worry about the units that these things have been measured with. And I hadn't picked this up at the time, but I did pick up as we prepared for this talk. There was some interesting validation on cystatin C in a paper by Lou et al. 10 years ago now, that also came up with a hazard ratio of 1.32. So we've got a 1.31 hazard ratio, or log hazard ratio, strictly. So very similar results in that study. Actually, that must be a bit of coincidence. You look at the size of their confidence and our confidence intervals. But yeah, certainly the work supports each other. Even if the precision of that support is a little bit.
Peter, just to add a quick note on cystatin C. So most people think about it as a kidney function biomarker, obviously because it's elevated when eGFR is low or it's associated with a lower eGFR. But I think what most people don't know is that it's associated with a biomarker of neurodegeneration, neurofilament light chain. So higher cystatin C is associated with higher NFL. So now, granted, is that a poor kidney function is associated with neurodegeneration, and cystatin C is a biomarker of that? Is cystatin C, an active player in that process? I don't know, but I think the importance of cystatin C, I'd recommend it for everyone, not just for Bortz biological age, but when considering that its association with NFL, I'd encourage everybody. I'm tracking it at every test, so it's a big one.
Right. So it's just biological age acceleration is normally distributed. It's not a particular surprise, as Michael said earlier. This is a linear model, and it's a linear model combining relatively normally distributed things. And where they weren't normally distributed, we logged them to make them more normally distributed. So that's no big surprise. But what's nice to see is that we are getting a decent span. There's a lot of people getting a plus or minus 10 score here. It's not particularly interesting if we tell everybody, oh, your biological age is plus 0.2 years or minus 0.2 years. We're getting, real discrimination across the range. Not many people scoring plus or minus 20, but some. But I think a decent, reasonable spread, so that somebody aged 50, being told your biological age acceleration is 40, 45, blah, blah, 60 typically. No, I think that's useful information. And then we kind of alluded to some of this already, Michael. Notwithstanding what I said about cystatin C, and you certainly, we don't disagree that cystatin C is one worth measuring. One of the things that we've done since the paper is we developed a no cystatin C model, because although some people are monitoring it, it's not that commonly measured, and it's relatively expensive. So we developed a no cystatin C model. It does dilute the predictive power. You can see on the left-hand panel here that there's significant dilution, but it's not so significant that we lose the validity of our clock. And we sort of felt that the people that hadn't measured cystatin C, going through the impute cystatin C to then conclude, was not really the efficient way of getting the optimal modeling. And so we've developed this model without cystatin C. It's still not 246% of the power of a PhenoAge, but it's still 173% of the predictive power of PhenoAge. So, a powerfully, usefully predictive model. The other thing we did was we moved from what I think most machine learners will be familiar with, and then those who aren't can look up, 5 nearest neighbors prediction for our imputation to a multivariate normal prediction. And again, people can look that up. I will not go into the details. But we saw a significant increase in predictive ability using multivariate normal, which I was slightly surprised by. And for those of you interested in the technical detail, 20 nearest neighbors, yes, did improve, but it didn't improve that much. And multivariate normal is a much more compact model. There's no individual lookups needed in such a model. So this is a sort of model that can be deployed with essentially 400 correlations and a 22 means and 22 and 22 means. Oh, and 22 standard deviations. So it's a much more compact model, much faster to calculate, although model computing power, that's not the end of the world. Um, but interestingly, more predictive. And so we've moved to multivariate normal imputation humanity. And so what you're seeing here with some further tweaks, which I think are not really worth going into, we're seeing this Nosistan C model with this improved imputation that's implemented at Humanity. You can send Humanity, if you pay for our premium subscription, your PDF with your blood biomarkers and get this model calculated for you. If you're a clinical testing lab, you can send us this through an API and get the blood BioAge returned with an associated report. And so, it's very nice. There's the judge. We're happy that what we have is something that we can really readily deliver to people with clinical reports that they have already. Clinical partners are offering this as an option in clinical reports within a specific context. We're really fulfilling, what was our ambition for when we developed this paper, which was to make blood BioAge available to lots and lots of people. So just to wrap up before we chat a bit more, acknowledgements. Yeah, there's a lot of people to thank here. All my co-authors on the paper, most obviously Jordan, who did all of the work, but Jordan's supervisors for his master's dissertation, who really helped me in terms of both the filling out the machine learning parts of the paper, and essentially bringing Jordan to us as somebody who could do a master's dissertation with us, and my other colleagues at Humanity, and in two forms, because some of those, Andrea Gugliarli and Lucia Claric did the work, or did some of the work that Jordan then leveraged, and then Pete Ward and Mike Gear, who are the founders of Humanity, who together with me brainstormed this idea in the first place, provided the funding to get it done. Thank you to all of them. On top of that, UK Biobank participants and the UK Biobank resource more generally. It's a fantastic resource. And encourage any researcher that wants to work in this field to have a look at it and think about what they can do. You do need to apply for access to the resource and pay for it. But considering what you get, the effort involved and the fee involved, are a really small relative to what you get for your money. Talked about humanities funding already, so yeah, thank you again. And then finally, just to acknowledge for those of you that are interested in AI, I co-developed this deck with Claude's Anthropics Claude, and judge for yourselves. But I'm happy it did all the layout work and all of the spade work that it's often so much hard work when you're developing something like this. So just to recapitulate what we started with, we have a solution to calculate blood biological age acceleration that is deployable on routine bloods. It's a broad signal. We saw those dimensions that we were looking at. It's not just one dimension of inflammation, for example. And I don't want to be too evangelical about this, but I strongly feel that having all of these measures in the units that people can relate to and act on and see being managed for the better, really means that this has got the potential to be impactful. And that humanity, what we're trying to do is bring that impactful um, set of measures to as many people as possible.
Thanks, Peter. That was great. The imputation, I have to say, I'm not a fan of imputation just because the data, you could impute like the population-based average for a given biomarker or the minimum for a given biomarker. So it's a challenge to pick what value to impute for a given biomarker. So how many of the 300,000 had actual full complete biomarker data?
All of them.
Ah, nice. Okay. Easy. Beautiful.
And
Perfect.
so, and so, and but then what we're doing when we're showing the imputation, we're saying is if we blind ourselves to all but those 9, does this work? And I guess we're saying it works. We're saying it doesn't work as well as if we knew all 25. But what we're not doing is imputing the minimum, and what we're not doing is imputing the population average. We're saying, given we know those 9, what can we expect the missing HbA1c or whatever to be, or the total cholesterol, given we know LDL. Probably don't find that in practice, but that's the approach. And what we're saying is using that approach where we're not simply, quite often in some sort of machine learning, you might have missing data and you might just put the average in um, and train your model on that basis because a model needs a complete scaffold. That's not what we're doing. What we're saying is that you've given us these 9 biomarkers and effectively construct a sub-model that says, how do those 9 biomarkers relate to biological age in a direct sort of linear way? And yes, it's not as good as the 22, but as I think we showed, but certainly I think certainly hinted, often that's performing, for example, as well as PhenoAge.
Nice. All right. So let me share some of these potential biomarker weak spots. And then maybe, there would be I don't know, something that we could do about it, but I don't know. If you look at total cholesterol, right? So TC. So the highest TC that someone could have using the Bortz clock is 385 milligrams per deciliter. If you put it in 390, they'll come up as and I'm using Jolt Sabo. I hope I'm saying his name right. He's a great guy. He made, as you guys met and had an YouTube interview. He created longevity tools, which basically anybody can use the Bortz clock for free. So when you try to enter 390 milligrams per deciliter for total cholesterol, it's an error message. You just can't go higher than that. But for 385, just putting in all of my data without showing all of my data, if I put in 385 with all of my data or close to my data, I get a biological age, Bortz age of 33.3 years. On the other hand, if I put in 160, which is closer to my actual data, you can see that the Bortz age goes to 38. So an older biological age for having a lower total cholesterol. So where I see some dispute in the published literature is that there's an inverse U shape for total cholesterol during aging. And, so total cholesterol on the y-axis, and this is a study, I think, of 16 million people, right? So it's not 1,000 people, right? This is probably closest to population-based average. Plotted against age up to 88 years. And you can see that low total cholesterol with values around 160 in men and around 170 in women are found in youth, right? So it makes me wonder about the UK Biobank cohort not having enough people that are truly chronologically young, because if you look at how total cholesterol changes during aging, and I get you mentioned you didn't have LDL in the model, but you do have ApoA1, which accounts for the HDL fraction or almost all of the HDL fraction of total cholesterol. So then your total cholesterol story is likely a LDL, VLDL, but VLDL is a minor component, right? So this should track with LDL too, because LDL shows a similar inverse U during aging, but you can see that it peaks, total cholesterol peaks around midlife, 40 to 55, 60, and then it starts to decline. And if I showed the data for centenarians, it would be even further reduced. So it makes me wonder in the UK Biobank model, or in modeling based on that, for people to have very high total cholesterol and the youngest biological ages relative to someone who has a TC of 160, sure, the amount of people that were younger than 20 or in the 20-year-old range, probably very few. but it also highlights that the people who are in their early to mid 50s were probably quote unquote healthier than the people at older chronological ages in order to have this, approximately 5-year disparity for biological age. So what are your thoughts? And then is there a way we can model this to account for it in the Bortz clock? Like I'm trying to help make the Bortz clock a better clock, the best.
Yeah. So I think you're right. And the issue is this U shape. We have built a linear model, and the linear model is driven by deaths monthly. So, what's going on at the right-hand side of this graph is driving. A couple of caveats to that. The first would be a to the extent that this on the right-hand side, we just forget about the left-hand side for this comment because it's a further complication, but on the right-hand side is just about age. Then the age part of our model picks that up. So I suspect what's happening is not only that you're seeing this pattern, but that you're seeing the pattern on the right-hand side as people become frailer, so that people who are more frail for a given age are seeing, lower levels of total cholesterol on the right-hand side. And so that's the sort of signal we're picking up. So the clock is, probably with this particular respect working well, in the 40, 45 plus domain. But at least that's where UK Biobank starts. So there is a caveat on our work, about younger ages. We did do some work that within the ranges that it works at each age range. But youthful people, somewhat different. In terms of how to improve, I think it's very good questions. I think that the first thing probably is just like we talked about stratifying by comorbidity. I think we could build clocks that were stratified by age group, and so recognize essentially that 25 to 40, 45 to 60, 60 plus. They're maybe not the right boundaries, but something along those lines would be a way to go. And it would be very interesting to see if we get different coefficients, whether we get better predictive power overall, firstly. Secondly, whether or not having done that, which coefficients, are good and bad at which ages. Yes, I think that is a way to go. For particularly young ages, we would need probably to go back to something like NHANES because the UK Biobank did survey that. If people watching have ideas, or in fact, or indeed own cohorts with that sort of data, we'd be interested in working with.
Nice. Yeah, that would be great in order to be able to separate the data or adjust for the comorbidities, especially because if you've got someone, even if they're in their, younger than the age range for UK Biobank, you may have some people who are using these biological age clocks to track it over time. And then they know that having a younger Bortz age is associated with a lower risk of death for all causes. And then they're like, well, my total cholesterol is 200. I'm going to push it to 350. I'm really going to increase my saturated fatty acid intake and decrease fiber because the youngest Bortz age is going to give me the best results. So I wouldn't want to mislead people into, you know what I mean? So, all right. So the next,
Absolutely. So I think let's just, if we can go back,
yeah,
Michael, just for a second. I think let's dwell on that for a moment. Actually, can we do something else first? If we could give out a big shout out to Zolt and his longevity tools. Yeah, people can go and calculate Bortz age and see the effects. But also what you're saying is very important. Thinking that improving your Bortz age directly by a specific intervention. What we're seeing is an association here. Do things that make you healthy, sleep well, eat well, exercise, have that affect your biomarkers. And certainly if your clinician recommends statins, take statins. Don't think, oh, but that's going to make my Bortz age do this or that. No, absolutely not. What we're identifying is associations, and the sort of pattern that you have identified here think is really helpful in that context. That, a it's it's perhaps working at particular ages better than others. What I would say is that, the advantage of our 25 marker clock is that if this particular marker is not quite perfect, it's only one amongst 25. Sorry, quite perfect at your particular age. It's overall helpful. By blending these things, I think we're still getting, meaningful results. But I think it is very important to, reiterate what you said. Don't assume that, you're going to make yourself healthier just by pulling a lever in Bortz age. For example, you have some concerns with vitamin D supplements. You've probably got an opinion on this. I am not convinced that extremely high levels of vitamin D are helpful. Certainly, a deficiency of vitamin D is a bad thing. So if you're vitamin D deficient, it, particularly if you're young. But you could improve your Bortz age by taking, very high levels of vitamin D supplement. I'm not convinced that's improving your health. It's improving, your specific biomarker. And so, yes, be wary of that. Go out and do more underlying healthy things in your lifestyle to improve your Bortz age.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the vitamin D because that's actually not on my list but it's a great point that you mentioned. And I've been thinking about that too, where you could quote unquote biohack it and take a super physiological dose of vitamin D and spike your circulating vitamin D levels to, greater than 45 or 50 nanograms. I think it's nanograms per mil and get a really young Bortz age, which makes me wonder about what do you think about data caps? So if the data in Bortz was trained on vitamin D within a certain range, and people are quote unquote biohacking vitamin D to go beyond that, you've got a cap. So you can't go younger. But you can only go based on what the model was trained on. So what are your thoughts on data caps?
I think they're a good idea. In fact, it's one of the little tweaks that I mentioned or didn't mention, but alluded to when we were going through. Yeah, I think we see particularly vitamin D, also testosterone, that there are biohackers out there, and we're getting uploads. And I think we can have a view as to whether or not it's beneficial. But I think the raw answer that would come out of the Bortz clock is misleading for those people. And so, yeah, data caps, absolutely.
Definitely. All right. So the next biomarker that could be a potential weak spot is SHBG. For those who don't know, sex hormone binding globulin, which it has been shown in large epidemiological studies, I'm not going to show it here, to increase during aging, higher levels associated with an increased all-cause mortality risk. So Bortz superficially identifies it as higher equals older. So for someone who has an SHBG of 120, and again, just entering my or generic data, you would get a Bortz age of around 38. But for someone who has an SHBG that's lower, about half that, you would get a younger biological age, right? So that clearly tracks with the old, higher is worse for SHBG. But SHBG is also dramatically increased in people on a calorie-restricted diet. So, and this is where there's a disparity in, a small study versus the large epidemiological. So in this study, you've got CR group, and this was people who were self-selected CR. So the magnitude of calorie restriction, was it 20% CR? Was it 15%? That's unclear, but we can kind of get an estimate of their caloric deficit by looking at BMI. So BMI of 19.1 is very lean. How much of a magnitude and percent reduction in calories is unclear, but when compared with the group that was vigorous exercisers, BMI still in the quote unquote lean range, 22.6. And then you had the Western diet group with an overweight BMI of 26.7. So what I want to highlight here is you can see that SHBG and the star is statistically significant. You can see that the SHBG group had, the calorie restricted group had an average SHBG of 238 nanomolar. And if we compare that versus the Western diet, it's 70% higher. Right now, then you could, granted, it wasn't significantly different from the exercise group, but even the exercise group was trending higher than the Western diet group. So now we've got this disparate data of you've got an intervention that is the gold standard for longevity in animal models and that improves cardiometabolic health biomarkers in people. and their SHBG is dramatically elevated. I mean, as a part of that story, you can see that their testosterone levels are far from optimal and borderline low, 12 nanomolar relative to the other two groups. And that probably links with SHBG. But what they also did in this study is that, how do you discern between SHBG increases during aging, and that's associated with metabolic syndrome components, as I'll show for some other data in a minute. But then you've got this potential small subset of people on CR where it's very high SHBG. Is this a pathological thing? Is CR maybe not good in people? So what they looked at was insulin sensitivity as indicated by the insulin sensitivity index by the Matsuda index. And even though it's just a correlation, you can see that this is a significant correlation where people who had highest SHBG were the most insulin sensitive. So that suggests that in certain specific cohorts, specifically in people who are calorie restricted, or maybe even very lean, maybe it's not a calorie restriction issue because you've got the exercise group who is also trending towards a higher SHBG. So if you're in that boat and you use the Bortz clock and your SHBG is very high, it's going to show up as a quote unquote older age. But if in fact you're on a calorie restricted diet and very lean or exercising, it's going to show you as older when the fact is, that could be the most beneficial having a higher SHBG within that context. So what are your thoughts? How can we account for that in an updated, better Bortz clock?
So a couple of thoughts. The first is that the sorry, yeah. I think caloric restriction probably is beneficial in humans. That's a personal view, so I sort of support the ethos underneath this page. But yeah, I think people can have their own view on that. Maybe it's the same thought actually, but the thing and maybe we're alluding to this at the bottom half of the slide. We talked already in a way about not being able to look at any one of the factors in the Bortz clocks in isolation. So, for example, what's going on with HbA1c in these people? And what the Bortz clock answers is if you hold HbA1c constant and everything else constant and vary SHBG, what happens across the population to your mortality? So yeah, there is two thoughts. The first one is this issue that perhaps aspects that are being picked up by the SHBG here are also being picked up by the other things that we're measuring. And so it's the thing in isolation that we need to be wary of. And so, for example, Michael, if you are go out and try caloric restriction, you'll see a whole lot of markers move. You're not just going to manage to move SHBG. And the question is, what does the Bortz clock do to that group in general? So it would be nice, actually, and maybe it can be inferred. We've been talking about, stratifying our models already to see what would come out with a model. Well, firstly, just see what Bortz age comes out for people who have low BMIs like this. And then see if we built a model just for those people, what would happen to the coefficients and whether or not SHBG looks, to have different properties in those subpopulations. So I think, yeah, two things. Can't look at one of these things in isolation necessarily. It's all of them together. And then I think it's inevitable. It is a bit unsatisfactory. We kind of want to know, do I want high or low SHBG? Well, it's high or low relative to other people with the same things in all the other measures that you have. It's a sort of question. So yeah, a stratified model, I think, would tell us a lot of interesting things.
or just the model for BMI too, adding BMI
Yeah,
into
yes,
yeah,
yeah.
that would be
Yeah.
great. That would be really great. So I hear you on it's the full context of the biomarkers, but even for a given HbA1c, which is in the Bortz, just if you only play around with it, you would predict that higher SHBG, HbA1c would kind of move correspondingly if this is a real correlation, with insulin sensitivity. But even if you hold HbA1c constant and move SHBG, it's going to look older. And yeah,
Well, I
I
think that's right. But what I'm saying is, ours is an ecological study. It's not a causal study. So I've kind of alluded to that in a different way, even with our testosterone and vitamin D supplements, and it's the same thing going on. So I think it's the association across the population. Um, a and so we're not necessarily saying SHBG is good or bad in itself, but what we're saying is in the context of all the other things, that SHBG increase is bad on that for the population as a whole. But it's only if you hold all those other things constant, and all those other things don't stay constant if you have a lifestyle intervention or you move from person A to person B.
Yeah. So just to push back a little bit on that, though. So just to
Mm.
put it into perspective. So I'm in this is why it becomes, I don't want to say this is my data, this is my story, but I am somewhat CR, and my BMI is relatively low, around 22, and my SHBG is, as high as 135. And in conjunction with that, when considering that, as I mentioned earlier, that higher SHBG links with components of the metabolic syndrome, I don't have any of those components. I don't have low HDL, high blood pressure, high glucose. HbA1c is at most 5.4%, still far below pre-diabetic. But based on the population-based averages, that would predict that having high SHBG should be quote unquote bad in my case. But it's actually probably not the case. It could be a marker of calorie restriction and leanness and more closer to insulin sensitivity relative to the population-based average. So anyway, the boards would miss people in my boat. I don't want to say I'm healthier than average, but it would miss people like me the way as currently constructed, which, I see it as a weak spot. I hope that there's a way we can
Yeah.
improve.
I- I'll go away and think about this and can maybe, afterwards correspond back and forth a bit about it. I'm suggesting, and it's more just as general statistical principle, that what may be happening is that we're capturing much of that through your HbA1c and your other markers. And so then what we look at is, it's what we're trying to do is compare effectively people with perhaps really good metabolics generally, and then what SHBG does, having built a model around really good metabolics generally already. And so it is this interplay amongst the variables that you know this, I hope I made reasonably clear earlier, can be misleading. You need to look at the whole thing together. It's a bit of a statistical conundrum. So it may be that that's going on, or it may be that it's a weakness of the model in the context of caloric restriction in particular, as you highlight, or just there may be a degree of U-shape going on here again, and that lower life frailty and the relationship with the SHBG may be different than the sort of effects that you and I have been talking about just now.
No, I think you've got it correctly coded where higher is worse because it increases during aging and it's associated with metabolic syndrome. So with the pure population-based averages, that is generally what you're going to see, that higher is worse, right? But it just suggests that there is a subset of the population who could be quote unquote healthier, who has high SHBG, and it just isn't captured because it's actually looked at as noise by the model. The group is so small that it's looked at as noise by the model because the gross population-based averages, if you've got higher SHBG, this is bad news.
Yeah. Yeah. So now just caveat that one last that it may be that for that population that we're, by capturing HbA1c, for example, that we're actually, we still have kind of the right answer, even though on the face of it, the SHBG contribution is sort of contradicting what we're looking at.
Yeah. All right. So moving forward. Okay. I hear you. Let's see. I've got one more. MCH. So mean corpuscular hemoglobin concentration. So the concentration of hemoglobin in red blood cells. So higher is correctly coded as older, but too low can also be an issue. So for those who don't know, just as a quick review, how do you calculate the average hemoglobin inside of red blood cells? So you take the hemoglobin concentration, you multiply it by 10, and then divide by red blood cells. So if you look at values that are most likely found in youth, hemoglobin of around 15 grams per deciliter, red blood cells around 5 million red blood cells per microliter. So 15 times 10 divided by 5, you get an MCH of 30, and just the given biological age using Bortz of say 34.6, just putting in the arbitrary numbers into the clock. Now, if you go lower, so hemoglobin, red blood cells and correspondingly hemoglobin declines during aging. So values of around 13 and 4, respectively, would be values you'd expect to find in an older person of advanced age relative to someone who's much younger, where you'd expect to see 15 and 5. So when you do the calculation, 13 times 10 divided by 4, you get an MCH of 32.5. So the MCH would increase in the quote unquote older hemoglobin and red blood cell counts, and correspondingly, you get an older biological age using Bortz. So this is correctly coded, where higher is worse. But here too, there may be a U shape where you can indeed go too high for hemoglobin and red blood cells. And to illustrate that, I've targeted hemoglobin of 16 and red blood cells of 6. So 16 times 10 divided by 6, you get an MCH of 25. And now it's even lower. It's the lowest compared to the quote unquote young group, 15 and 5, and the old group, 13 and 4, where you see the biological age is 33.2 years. So just to highlight this point a bit more, so this is the levels of red blood cells and hemoglobin according to metabolic syndrome components. So do you have up to 5 of the metabolic syndrome components defined as having high waist circumference, high triglycerides, high blood pressure, high glucose, low HDL. So what we can see is that for people who had the highest red blood cells around 6, or if we round up 5.95 is 6, as I just showed in the previous slide, they had all 5 components of the metabolic syndrome. And similarly for hemoglobin, an average of 16 grams per deciliter, here too, they have all the components of metabolic syndrome. But on the other hand, Bortz would code them as having the youngest Bortz age based on an MCH of 25. And just to show that this is like a worsening with having more components of the metabolic syndrome. So from 0 to 5 components, obviously, if you have all 5 components of the metabolic syndrome, this is worse, quote unquote, worse health. You can see that as red blood cells increase from 4.44, 4.55, 4.8, 5.531, and then up to around 6, you've got more components of the metabolic syndrome. And that same trend for hemoglobin. So this would suggest going too high for hemoglobin and too high for red blood cells would lead to an MCH that's quote unquote too low. But this would be incorrectly identified by Bortz as having a quote unquote young biological age, up to around 2 years younger. And I get that it could be, it's within the context of everything else. You would see if hemoglobin and red blood cells are higher or on the higher side, you probably also see higher glucose because, that's a part of the model, and lower ApoA1, that's also part of the Bortz model. So some of that would probably be captured, but even if you hold all of those variables constant and just manipulate the MCH down from around 30 to 25, you do get around a 2-year reduction, holding everything else constant, whether it's low or high. So and I should say, part of me has a selfish, I get the population-based, health-based, approach where we want to try to help people understand their health with biomarkers. But, there's a longevity World Cup that I can't win this year. I won it last year in PhenoAge because my data for MCH is pretty close to youthful, but there are people who have values that are too high that are coded as younger and they have a SHBG that's high or low and they're coded as younger, So I can't compete in this year's competition because it looks like I'm older than I am, but my data based on these three variables has quantified me older by a few years relative to where I should probably actually be.
Yeah, I think you've acknowledged it's everything together sort of thing, and you probably end up going back over the same to and fro. So I think stratified models would be nice, and it'd be interesting to see if we. I guess the problem with people winning these longevity Olympics is that none of thankfully it's not a problem for society, but a problem for us modelers. It's not enough of them are falling sick and dying to necessarily have a big cohort to design, or we're going to need to wait a very long time. But I think it's fair to say, yeah, there are different properties going on in that domain. But there are also all of these things combined, and it comes back to do all those things that are going to make your overall profile better. Don't get hung up on a particular biomarker. Um, in terms of our work, certainly in terms of your clinician telling you this biomarker is problematic and symptomatic of disease, yeah, absolutely, pay attention to that. But don't think that you can game the Bortz age and do anything except game the Bortz age.
I think most clinicians would probably miss some of these nuances in biomarkers because hemoglobin of 16 is still within the range and MCH of 25 is still within the range, albeit, at the extremes of the range, reference range, so clinicians may miss that. I don't know. I'm hoping that, the Bortz clock is version 1.0, and maybe I can quote unquote help nudge you to take another look at
Yep.
some of these data. And yeah, that because if there's a way we can make it better, especially by stratification, yeah, and I hear you on trying to game the system. I'm all against that, which is another reason why I'm not quote unquote competing in this year's Longevity World Cup. I refuse to take these super physiological doses of vitamin D just to get a certain number on a clock. But there may be people who do that, and I'm just not that guy. I'm more interested for the long-term health and getting it all right. So yeah, if and I'd happy to collaborate on a paper too, where if that's something that we can submit. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think we're delighted to sort of explore further where we can take, I think particularly the stratification idea. Um, there's certainly stratifications I think we can do within UK Biobank, but there are some that can't be done. And it would be nice, I think, thinking also about comorbidities. Not quite sure how that will work as a commercial product for us, but it's still interesting work. But certainly the stratification and the interactions, I think, are you know um, steps forward.
In terms of the commercial product, it would be that, it's basically that the Bortz clock is impervious. It has no weaknesses if we can account for potential weaknesses, right? And then it could be more readily implemented, especially if it ends up having, a higher C index or C statistic than PhenoAge, because PhenoAge has its own weak spots. As you know, people who supplement with creatine will have a higher creatinine. And then only looking at white blood cells, which are on PhenoAge, that may be problematic because white blood cells can stay constant over time, but neutrophils and monocytes are well documented to increase and lymphocytes decrease. So if that's the case, which is at the population-based average, which is generally the case in most people, they'll see no change in white blood cells, but the distributions within the white blood cells are changing during aging, and it's missed in PhenoAge, right? So, but you've got the UK Biobank at 300,000 people relative to NHANES of 12,000 people. So the potential for it to be the best clock is there, So I see that as a commercial utility where
Yeah.
it's readily implemented, and I'm sure you see for PhenoAge. I mean, it's not just the initial papers that Morgan Levine has published. I mean, there's a variety of labs and other cohorts in other chronic conditions, whether it's COVID or dementia risk, that paper after paper are using that as a tool to try to assess risk, basically
Mhm,
prognostic
mhm.
risk. So if boards could be basically even implemented, I see if boards can be the best clock, maybe more and more people would so that to me is the best commercial utility.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, no, and I think that's absolutely fair. But yeah,
Cool.
I'm delighted to think about how we could progress these things.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Peter. That was great. Looking forward to collaborating more going forward, and have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Bye.